Okay, go ahead, Hannah.
Thank you very much. So the next committee before us this afternoon is the Committee of the Whole, and I'm joined by the entire council. So our first committee, our agenda bill item is 22971. This is the Fire Department Strategic Plan. So the Fire Department will present a more in-depth look at the first 4 goals in the Fire Department Strategic Plan related to staffing, recruitment, diversity, and EMS response. And for this, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Hewitt.
Hi, good afternoon, Council. Bill Hewitt with the Fire Department. And a couple meetings ago, we came to you, to the Public Safety Committee, and presented kind of a very quick overview of the Fire Department Strategic Plan that was completed at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. Today, what I was hoping to do was to come back here to Committee of the Whole and spend a little more time going through a little more in-depth look at some of the sections of the plan. And then we actually are looking forward to coming back again on the 21st to do the other half of the plan. So we're kind of breaking it up into 2 halves here to walk through that. So I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here. Stand by 1 second. Okay. And if this looks very familiar, it's because pretty much it's a repeat of the of the first time that we did it, except for I cut and pasted some of the things that we're going to focus on today. So in this PowerPoint that you have in your packet, you'll see an overview of all 10 of the goals. Today, we're going to focus on first 4 goals here, which is to stabilize the staffing in the fire department, continue our recruitment efforts to maintain an active hiring list, continue to promote a culture that values diversity within the organization, and improve on our EMS response and support system. So today, those are the 4 areas that we're going to kind of focus on, and we will kind of jump right in here into that first goal, which was to stabilize our staffing. So in the plan, and just again to kind of review this plan, we spent the 2019 working through the planning process. We completed the plan essentially in February of 2020. COVID hit. We kind of stuck the plan on the shelf at that point as we were dealing with all of the other things COVID related. And so now we're kind of bringing it back out, dusting it off and reviving it here. So some of the goals that we have in this plan, even though we never rolled out the full plan, we were able to use some of these in the mid-biennium adjustments that we made between 2019, 2020, and a little bit when we looked at the 21-22 budget. So again, goal number 1 there was to stabilize our staffing. And first recommendation in there was to increase the staffing to meet all of our contractual requirements. This was one of the things that we worked on in that mid-biennium adjustments between 2019 and 2020. Council approved 7 additional FTEs. And the hard part about that is it took us, just due to a host of reasons, our attrition rates and some other things, took us almost 18 months to actually see those seven additional FTEs come to fruition. And yesterday, June 6th, marked the first day our most recent recruit academy here finished up their academy at the end of last week, and March 6th was the first day that those 10 new recruits from the academy actually made it out into the stations to start pulling shifts. So the recommendation in the plan to add those additional FTEs. As of yesterday, that has been accomplished. And so we've reached this for the first time in quite a while. We reached a full level of staffing, and look forward to seeing what our new normal looks like here this week. This next recommendation on here was to increase the recruiting efforts for volunteer staffing. Again, going back to that 2019-2020 mid-biennium adjustments, we added a volunteer coordinator, basically a full-time training captain who is working on nothing but trying to increase our volunteer firefighter pool and increase the pool and to get them trained faster and out filling seats. This effort has led to a slight increase in the number of shift-ready folks, number of shift-ready volunteers that we have. Shift-ready being the term we use to talk about volunteers who are able to fill a minimum staff seat out in the fire district. But those numbers, the increase has been about 0.8 of a volunteer over that course of the year. So it's when we look at the number of shift-ready volunteers we had each month over the last year, that number increased just about one volunteer per month over what it was in 2019. So we're moving the needle, but it's a very slow move, and it's a long ways from reaching the full numbers that the strategic plan has indicated we need. I will say that the captain that's been doing this, Captain Jeff Heinrichs, he's been doing a phenomenal job of getting people in the door. While our number of shift-ready volunteers right now is fairly low, he's brought in quite a few new volunteers into the program that are in various stages of training. The problem is that we continue to see a lot of hiring going on in fire departments up and down the I-5 corridor, and it seems as fast as we get them in and trained, they're getting hired into full-time jobs in fire departments up and down. But we are working on that. And again, we have seen some modest gains in there, and we'll continue to see what happens here this year based on a lot of the recruiting efforts that Captain Heinrichs has been working on. One of the goals in there also was to look at improving the retention of those volunteer staff. And again, this has just been a very tough one. And it's not just tough for us managing Fire District 8, but talking with all of our neighboring departments, North Whatcom, South Whatcom, all Fire District 7, all the fire districts throughout the county are continuing to have the same issues with retention, and that where a lot of our volunteers in the past had been folks that wanted to volunteer to help their community and were happy with their full-time jobs. Now the majority of our volunteer pool is coming from younger individuals who are looking to volunteer to gain skills so that they can get a full-time job in the fire service. And so again, this is not just a problem that affects us, but kind of up and down the I-5 corridor here, that we're losing a lot as we're seeing a lot of turnover in the fire service and a lot of new positions coming online. The next goal is to look at continue the recruitment efforts, maintain an active hiring list in preparation of a significant number of retirements. So looking at our 10-year history on attrition, the previous 10 years, we were looking at about an average of 5 people a year that we were losing through attrition here in our career ranks. This year, we are anticipating that number to be closer to 8 next year. We, at a minimum, we know it'll be 8, but at the same time, we also know that next year we'll have at least 42 people in the department that are eligible for retirement. So we've got quite a bit of potential for attrition, and that's kind of what this was looking at, is that our hiring process and our training process is fairly lengthy. The hiring process alone normally takes us about 3 to 6 months from, well, actually, it's been taking us about 6 months to get through the hiring process. We can do some on a little more condensed basis, depending on if we're looking just straight at laterals versus laterals and entry levels. But for the most part, to get the diverse applicant pool that we've been looking at for the last several classes, it takes about 6 months to get through that entire hiring process.
Chief Hewitt, sorry to interrupt. Just a quick question. How many people did you say are eligible to retire right now? What was that number?
For 22, we're looking at 42 people.
That's what I thought you said. I wasn't sure I heard myself correctly. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, the numbers. Now, I'll tell you that 42 is a number of people that have achieved a certain age to meet the ability to retire under the state retirement system. So that 42 represents folks that have been here at least 20 years and meet that minimum age. That doesn't mean that all 42 of them will go in that year. There's not everybody goes at the first year that they're eligible age-wise to go. But again, we've already been notified of at least, I think it's 8 people next year that are planning on retiring next year. So
there's a big possibility for a lot of turnover in the next couple of years. We're going to need a lot of new firefighters. Yes.
And so this hiring process, the reason this goal is in here is that, we have been planning and budgeting for one recruitment a year. And again, these processes take a lot of time. They also, there's also significant costs involved with it. Our hiring process costs us about $50,000 every time we go to hire. And then when we actually run up the academy, there's another about $250 in costs for running the academy and onboarding firefighters each year. Right now, with the attrition rates that we're looking at, we're pretty much guaranteed to, just for attrition, guaranteed to need one recruit academy a year for the foreseeable future. And I say that just for attrition, because what that means is any other additional programs we want to look at as an organization basically means that we'll need to run in at least 2 academies a year to handle both the attrition rate and growth of new programs. One new program that's not anywhere in the strategic plan, but is part of the EMS plan, is the addition of an additional medic unit for the countywide EMS system. Right now, we actually are moving what would have been our 2022 attrition academy. We're moving that up to the fall of 21 so that we can accommodate in early 22 an academy to handle that increased medic unit. So there's a lot that goes into this, into that recruitment effort. The other big thing that kind of goes along in that too is currently the way that we staff our recruit academy is we have one person that's full-time that does nothing but deal with recruit academy and probationary firefighters. But when it's time to actually run the academy, we pull 3 additional, 1 additional captain, 2 additional firefighters away from shift and have them work in training during the academy. And while that model was okay for us when we used to run one academy every other year, now that we're looking at running 2 academies a year, that model doesn't make as much sense financially. It also, the other thing that it's hurt us on is we reached this point where we're down on personnel. That's why we're hiring to run an academy. And then to run that academy, we have to take 3 more personnel away from the street to go run that academy. So, and I just bring that up as we start moving forward. Understand that that'll be some of our discussions later on when we get into or later in the year when we start talking about budget adjustments and other things. Is that's one of the items that we still need to try and find a way to address is how we staff for staffing. Okay, let's move on here. Continue to promote a culture that values diversity within the organization. And on this one too, I need to make a correction from the last, when I came to you before at the Public Safety Committee, I had mentioned that this was an employee-driven goal that came forward. And in the last meeting, I think I mentioned that it came from a work group from within the local, and it actually, I was corrected afterwards by some of our members here that this was actually, while it's something that's important to all of us and has been, we've been wanting to make some strides on this, and we have made quite a few strides in our hiring portion of it. We have 3 of our members, in particular, Marie Buzzard, who just retired, and Beth Carroll and Sarah Pernick, 3 that actually went out on their own accord, worked with a local service here to help look at what we do here in the fire department and develop some of these specific recommendations for us as a department. So I want to correct that from the last time, and then also say thank you to the 3 women that really helped drive this and get these goals set up for us for the plan. So again, kind of going back, council has seen us or has seen presentations from myself and our former HR manager about our diversity and hiring. And we've done quite a bit here over the last several years to kind of move the needle in getting more diversity in our candidates and more diversity into our recruit academies. One of the things, though, that we have not addressed is really looking at equity and inclusion training throughout the department, and how those new diverse candidates fit throughout the organization. So one of the big things that we need to move on, and we're actually working right now in partnership with HR on working on some training for this year so that we can start to implement an annual training program on diversity issues. We also, along with looking at the diversity, equity, inclusion within our employees, we also want to talk about how we deliver appropriate services to our communities and making sure that our folks, again, we're behind the times here at the fire department related to a lot of the implicit bias and other training that our partners in law enforcement have gone through. So we're going to look at how do we implement that, roll that out here within the fire department. And then the last one, develop a robust recruitment strategy to encourage qualified applicants of all backgrounds. Again, we've done fairly well on adjusting adjusting our entry level process to remove barriers for a more diverse pool of candidates, but we have not actually done anything to go out and try and recruit more of those candidates in. So we've done well on removing barriers, and that has increased the diversity in our programs, but we have not done a good job of reaching out and actively trying to recruit folks. And so that's one piece of the plan that we still need to work on for the future. Okay, the last goal that we'll cover here today is improve the EMS response and support system. So you'll hear me talk today, you'll hear me talk next council meeting, and probably many other times in the future about we need the right tool for the job. Currently, in the fire department, we have basically what I'll say are two tools in our toolbox. I have the advanced life support paramedic units, and I have our fire companies that work back and forth, or cross staff is what we call it, between some sort of fire truck and an ambulance. And so when we are going out and dealing with medical emergencies, we're kind of limited. We're limited to those two tools. It's either, and honestly, it's either we're sending a fire company out, or we're sending a fire company and an ALS unit out. And we need to look at some additional tools for this toolbox. And one of those is staffing dedicated BLS ambulances, so that when our BLS crews deal with some of the lower acuity calls, and every time that we send them out, though, we're taking that coverage from the area fire station out of service to go handle the lower acuity calls, which means if we have a fire or a high acuity, say like CPR in progress call, now that engine company or that main resource for that fire station's area is out of service on that lower acuity call. We need to look at having a resource like the dedicated BLS ambulances that are available that can handle some of those lower acuity calls, leave our resources there that are available for those high acuity and the fire calls. So that is definitely one additional tool we need in our toolbox, is that dedicated resource. The other thing that goes along with that, when I say that fire company, it's not just being out of service to go handle the call, but it's transporting them to the hospital, taking them far out of their area, and creating this turnaround time where there's no units in those particular neighborhoods because they're taking maybe a non-emergent basic life support patient up to the hospital. Also, in looking at improving those responses, is to look at, are there ways for us to not to have to respond? So in this case, the second recommendation here is to look at a embedded peak time nurse in the communication center. That was the original recommendation from the consultants, was to look at this, a single embedded nurse in the communication center that would work peak times to try and divert calls away from being dispatched. What we've been looking at, again, through the Whatcom County EMS, some of the subcommittees, the Technical Advisory Board and other subcommittees, the Whatcom County EMS system, we've been looking at the ability to implement, instead of a single embedded nurse in our dispatch center, is to look at, are there existing nurse hotlines or other telehealth type programs to where, again, some of those lower acuity calls we could divert to a telehealth type program and avoid dispatching of units altogether. So our dispatch chief, Dan McDermott, and our EMS chief, Scott Rickman, they've been working together along with Whatcom County EMS and the company that provides our emergency medical dispatch software to look at, are there other options out there for us? The last recommendation on here, increase the support staff for the second community paramedic. And again, that was something that we completed here at the mid-biennium between 19 and 20. We were able to secure funding through the Whatcom County EMS levy for actually 2 additional community paramedics in the county, one here at Bellingham Fire, or I should say a second one here at Bellingham Fire, and then a third one that works out of Fire District 7 out in Ferndale. So we have increased that support to the community paramedic program. Important though, since this plan was put together at the end of 2019, all of this was done ahead of all of our discussions about unarmed co-response programs, and also ahead of the changes in legislation that have come through regarding how mental health calls are handled here in the state of Washington. So expect that while I have it written on here that we completed that in 2020, expect that we'll have some additional conversation in the future about how units similar to what our community paramedics are, how they may look in this overall picture of mental health response. So that's kind of the update on those 4. And I will say, I'm going to come back around to the camera here. So those 4 topics are probably, in this plan, those are probably the 4 biggest ticket items that are in this plan, as well as far as costs and outlay and probably some of the biggest lifts in here effort wise. So we'll be happy to take some questions. And
thank you, Chief Hewitt. So this item is brought before us at our request and for discussion and information only. So I'll turn it over to council. Are there any questions for Chief Hewitt? Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you, Chief, for presenting. I would like to go back to 2 of the items that you mentioned, which I'm fully supportive of. I just want to understand better. We've talked about having dedicated BLS units for a while to handle what dispatch decides are only need the basic level of life support, and basically to address call volume in that way. We've talked about it for a long time. How close are we to getting to the first dedicated BLS unit, and how far away is a second BLS unit?
Well, to staff, basically it takes 10 additional firefighters to staff a unit, 20 or a 2-person unit like that. It takes 10 additional firefighters to staff it 24 hours a day. So we had a lot of discussion in the past about this. This was one of the items we talked about in the RFA process. And again, we had talked about it at council several years ago, and at that time, council's direction was to go build the strategic plan so we could kind of validate the need for it. And so right now, to move forward with it, it would be looking at an increase of 10 FTEs to get a unit on the road.
I'm going to go to Councilmember Anderson, and then I'll come at the end of the list. I'll look back around to you, Councilmember Lillquist. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. So this is a question and then a comment hooked to it. It's about the Goal 4 recommendation, the embedded peak time nurse into the communications center. Have you done the analysis on the amount of calls that could go to a nurse hotline or someone embedded within the 911 center to have an idea what rate that would be. Are we looking at hundreds or thousands? And then my comment, and I've mentioned this to you before, but I'll just make the comment available to council members. I do, if the numbers are there and it makes sense to do it, I definitely support it. But I support someone who's either an EMT or a local nurse versus using a hotline. If we were going to create additional positions within the city and county, I would really prefer that to be a local position for someone in the community or surrounding area to be paid within our unions versus paying money to a company somewhere in Yakima for people working a hotline. I think if we're looking at jobs, I would like those jobs to be here because we know our local dollars circulating back into our community helps us overall. It's better to circle it versus sending it out. And I've kind of mentioned that in some regards, I do feel like this work is part of our EMS staffing to be able to assist with those calls. And I kind of feel like it's taking a job out of the community. So that I would really kind of balk at. So I'd much rather see an embedded nurse versus a call center. But if you could speak to what those numbers look like, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and unfortunately today I don't have the numbers available. I know, again, our dispatch chief and our EMS chief have been working on looking at varying, because it really depends on the level of program that we get into. Is kind of the variance there. We've been looking at programs that are going on in other parts of the U.S. and I know Dan has some, or Dan McDermott, our dispatch chief, has started looking at some of the numbers out there, but I don't have any firm numbers to give you. We've been focused more on the accuracy of those programs and looking at the areas that use them, finding the right system. When I say accuracy, is that in calls that get sent over to the telehealth program, what's the percentage of them that come back around to EMS for dispatch? So we've been more focused on trying to find the most accurate program that has the triage, delivers calls to telehealth that come back on a very low percentage rate. So as far as the local embedded nurse versus the nurse hotline thing, and I respect, and Councilmember Anderson and I have had some good conversations over this and totally respect your position on wanting to keep work here locally and keep work within local unions here. The one thing that I'll say is the hardest part in that is the benefit of having a 24/7 program versus hiring one nurse that gives us 40 hours of coverage, say 50 weeks a year. If you assume there's vacation and that for that person. So that's probably the biggest challenge, is we know that it takes about 4.6 people to staff something 24/7. So that's just the challenge that we see, is where do we get the best bang for the buck, to say, for what we're looking for.
That's where those numbers and being able to take a look at the spread of where are those calls coming in. Do we need something 24/7 to start out with? So that's going to be information I'm going to want to have available so that we could see where those calls are coming in, what days, what times, so we can do the analysis of what the true need is and where best to spend our funding.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thanks for the opportunity to delve into this a little bit deeper in a couple of discussions. I'm curious about the point that you brought up right at the end there with the state legislation that's potentially going to be changing the way that we respond to behavioral health calls. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Is that potentially something that the community paramedics are going to be doing more of?
The change in state law, there's a change coming here in July that severely restricts law enforcement's ability to respond to certain types of mental health calls. That currently mental health calls, if you call 911 for somebody in mental health crisis, currently the law enforcement has been the go-to for the 911 served group. If you think of 911 strictly as right now, you have three choices, right? A police officer, a fire truck, or an ambulance. And historically, calls for service for mental health have been directed towards law enforcement. With these changes in the state law enforcement on a lot of those calls will no longer be an option. And so we need to find a new option, some sort of either fourth tool or training up one of the other, training up the EMS wing to be able to handle those. So that's what I was talking about on those changes, is we're going to have to look at some sort of other tool. Now, as far as community paramedicine goes, I will say that I don't want to blur the lines between our current model of community paramedicine and a future unarmed co-responder type program. Because very much our current community paramedic program is all about the long-term prevention. It's all about helping people over the long term to get them to move them away from what has caused them to use 911 as their primary healthcare provider. And so while I believe we'll see in the future some sort of crisis response that looks a lot like community paramedicine, as far as EMT and some sort of mental health provider working together in a vehicle. It'll look a lot like our community paramedic program, but I do want to be clear that it's not the same thing, right? We need some sort of crisis response model that adds, just like I said, the tools in the toolbox. I need, in a perfect world, I need fire trucks, I need ALS ambulances, I need BLS ambulances, and I need some sort of crisis responder to deal with mental health calls. Those are the four tools that we need in our toolbox. The strategic plan didn't address that fourth tool because, again, we're dealing with data that's almost 2 years old. And things have evolved, as we all are well aware. Things evolved quite a bit here in the last year. So that's why I'm just kind of putting a placeholder out there to say, when you saw that we improved community paramedicine, don't think that solves the crisis response end.
Councilmember Hamel.
I want to drill into that just a little bit more. Councilmember Hoffman did ask the majority of my question, but I want council to be updated as to what's happening with that unarmed response piece. There's been a group of people that have been meeting. They were meeting every week. I was on that team for a while. And then it became much more technical. I think there's 720 or 740 different call types at Prospect alone. So it's a very complicated factor. There's a question about number of calls. I know that I don't have the actual numbers if this was related to behavioral health, but for behavioral health calls that begin and end as behavioral health only, it's 3.84%. So that's why we had talked before about adding a police officer to the response for the unarmed response initially during pilot, so we could get some data, so we could expand that call type signature so it's much larger. I'm hoping to get to about 11 to 12%. Chief Pute's absolutely correct. We are facing a deadline. There's a confluence of events that have happened with the state legislature pushing through, I think it's House Bill 5476, making that law. That means that law enforcement will not respond to certain types of calls, or they would respond very differently than they currently do. We were fortunate that group that I spoke of just recently, just before, has been meeting. So we're ahead of the curve a little bit, but we're facing down a month and a half, basically. Fire was not invited to the table. Bellingham Fire was not invited to the table in a way that I wanted to see until kind of later in the game. I really think that Chief McDermott's perspectives and viewpoints are very valuable and needed to be added. Also, Chief Rickman as well. We have outstanding division chiefs that are doing good work, and they need to be at the table for that conversation. But things are changing, and they're changing quick. And I just want to make sure council understands that there has to be a response to some of these, all of these calls. And what that's going to look like is going to be evolving rapidly. So I just want that to be on everyone's radar screen, that this is and the group that was meeting before was primarily county folks, including EMS folks and county health department. We don't have a health department, so we can't, who do we staff this with? So anyway, I just wanted to underscore that point, and hopefully we can all continue to work together to, make sure that people's patient outcomes are good. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Councilmember Vargas.
Thanks, Chief, for letting us delve into this a little deeper. A couple things. BLS units. Obviously, we want to spend our time and our resources wisely. So sending the right equipment instead of sending a fire truck when we don't need it. Want to support us getting there. I know we hired a few people previously to do so. But the question is there, it seems to me there was some sort of ordinances or policy that did not allow us to just send a car and not a fire truck. Can you explain that portion for me? And if there's something that we can fix that will help us get there sooner? That's one question. I have another one, but I'll hold and go to that one.
Well, there's no policies, restrictions, or anything that deal with that. I will say if we get to the point where we have those dedicated BLS resources, certainly within the fire department in cooperation with our labor unit, we'll be identifying what calls different types of resources get sent to. At the end of the day, what we're really, the biggest focus is that we want to try and keep our fire companies in their first due territories. And that's to make them available not just for fires, because obviously over time, fire has become a small portion of the vast services we do. We want them in their territories because they are the first response for everything. They are the first response when your neighbor needs CPR. They are the first response when a car collision occurs. They are the first response when a fire occurs. We want them to be in their area. When we talk about trying to, whether it's preventing flashover in a fire or whether it's preventing brain death from occurring when somebody goes into sudden cardiac arrest, we want them in their territories so that we're able to make those 4-minute response times in those geographic areas. So by having dedicated transport units, we eliminate, even if we end up sending a fire truck, because again, only 2 BLS cars means only 2 out of the 6 city stations would have those BLS cars in their territories. But even if we send a closest fire truck and the BLS car comes in and does the transport, that leaves that fire truck in their territory, ready to go to that next call, ready to immediately respond to those high acuities. So again, when we reach the point where we have those resources, there'll be a lot of internal within the department, some internal conversation about how we're deploying those and that. But the key is that having those resources allow us to keep that first response that's in your neighborhood fire station in your neighborhood. And that's the most important thing.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, thank you so much for recognizing me. I'm trying to figure out what exactly is left, because I wanted to talk also about the unarmed co-responder model. And in particular, I thought the connection here is that whether it's the 3% or 11%, some number of calls could be taken away from EMS and given to a more appropriate response model. I guess what I heard Mr. Hamill say was disconcerting. I was going to ask Chief Hewitt how involved and what level of involvement has his staff had in planning that unarmed co-responder mental health crisis component. And Mr. Hamill, you seem to imply that there is definitely involvement now, but it wasn't necessarily there at the level you would like to have seen early on. So I'm not even sure who I'd want to ask the question of, Mr. Hewitt or Mr. Hamill. Do we feel we're getting now adequate input into that unarmed co-responder model? Because it really will help out our entire EMS system to deliver better.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in there in that we have, again, Chief Rickman, Chief McDermott from our dispatch center, from our EMS division. They have been engaged here for the last couple of months, I believe, in these discussions and that. Also, when you're talking about like the 3% too, I think some of that is, or that lower percentage rate of calls that would go to this type of unit too. A lot of those numbers were generated early, just looking at what medical calls that these crisis intervention units would be able to take away from medical units. The bigger number is the number of law enforcement calls that will no longer be calls for law enforcement, but would instead be calls for this crisis intervention. We've already seen locally, we've already seen our call numbers for EMS units rise as a lot, or as some of these calls have already been diverted towards EMS from law enforcement. And so the worry is, when all of these changes are fully implemented, if we don't have that crisis response unit identified, that, it has the potential to almost double the call load of our already overburdened EMS units here within the city.
Well, to be clear, I don't want to send EMS personnel to a mental health call unless those EMS personnel are, cross-trained in mental health. I don't want to unburden your paramedics, your EMTs with the wrong kind of call any more than I want to burden the police with the wrong kind of call. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamill, did you want to respond to Councilmember Lillquist?
Sure. I just want to clarify a couple of things. One is that I don't think that the kind of the late to the game invitation for Bellingham Fire was a deliberate thing. I don't think there wasn't a territorial thing. That's not what was happening. There's a lot of expertise on the EMS side of the street, if you will. And the irony is that the county, in looking at this, I think is a little bit reluctant to send an unarmed response to a faraway destination where suddenly things go wrong and the sheriff's deputy is 10 minutes away or whatever the timing problem is. So it's ironic that the county has actually done a lot of good work to help get a program examined, looked at, fed with data, and we're getting pretty close. So the numbers that I was talking about, those were presented to this council probably a month ago by Ann Deacon when she came and talked about this subject. So it's in your previous packets if you want to go back and take a look at those for reference. There might even be some the actual numbers versus percentages. So that might be good data for you all to take a look at. I just feel the pressure of trying to get something completed here by this deadline that's been imposed upon us by the state. This is a similar thing happened with the Blake decision with the with the drug piece. I just don't think that there was a lot of a thorough examination of consequences, especially for localities that have to then figure the stuff out. I don't know what other communities in the state are doing on this. I'm pretty sure that we're just one of maybe a handful of communities that have been examining, how are we going to do this on armed response? There's 291 cities, over 10,000 people in the state of Washington. I'm willing to bet that a very few are going to have a solution for this. That means that some patients are not going to have good outcomes. And that's really the goal here, is to get people the help that they need and make sure it's done safely. And so we don't want to send people into situations that are not safe. So I think the work's being done. I'm glad that Chief McDermott's on those calls. We're going to be spooling that up again here in a bit, I think, to examine pilot data. So more to come.
Councilmember Vargas.
Thanks. Chief, one more thing I'm hoping you can walk us through a little bit, because sometimes I get a little confused on how this all works out in regards to dispatch. Now, I've always believed we should just have one collaborated dispatch. And I know fire has an element that is all their own. And if we've been talking the last couple of months about how we're going to help people with mental health focus on an unarmed response, you're talking about having a nurse. Now, I want to know how all of this, maybe you can break this down for me a little bit, how all of this layers on each other in regards to the GRACE program and reducing the amount of calls that we have that are mental health calls, that they not go to police and not go to fire, but they go to an appropriate person. So can you explain to me how the fire dispatch versus the police and the chief dispatch, or the sheriff and the police dispatch and the mental health, can you give me a clearer picture of this? Is it clear what I'm asking?
Well, it's somewhat, yes. There's a whole lot of parts in what you just unpacked there. So I'll try and see how we can address this. But so to start with, again, both centers use, a person calls 911. Right now, if it's a fire or medical emergency, they get instantly connected over to the fire dispatch center, where we go through a triage of asking questions to determine what the appropriate response needs to be to that call. If it's not a fire or EMS call, it stays over at WATCOM, which is the 911 public safety answering point, and the law enforcement dispatch center. And again, they go through a myriad of questions to determine the appropriate agency and the appropriate response from their side. So as we start talking about this crisis response thing, it is one of the questions that the committee that Councilmember Hamill is on, that our division chiefs have been engaged in. One of the important questions going on is, again, going back to one of my first statements, at the moment in 911, we think police, fire, ambulance. We need to change to be thinking about police, fire, ambulance, mental health response. And so, part of what that committee is looking at right now is what triage methods can we use to determine determine what gets this specialized mental health response, and how do we dispatch those folks out, and until we have some. Well, actually, that's probably the best way that I can. Does that kind of address what you're looking for?
It does in a way. I guess where I'm kind of trying to figure out and get to in that is, we don't have a lot of resources. So pooling our resources and pooling our money together is how we are more effective in a small community like this. And I'm wondering if the triage cannot just be done at the dispatch center, and instead of having it to go all the way to fire and just get and then become more people that have to touch it, is there not a way that it just goes to 911, it gets triaged properly there, we have the people we need there, and then if it's fire, it goes to fire? I just feel like we're adding more staff when down the line where that staff should maybe be at the beginning in where those calls are taken in and through that triage. And so I'm just struggling with that. And granted, I am biased. I want one dispatch center, but I know there's a lot of union conversations to have there. And it's a very controversial subject. However, I'm just looking at it in regards to logistics, resources, and money, and pooling those things together and making sure that we are doing that in a way that solves our problems earlier instead of it going to EMS and then to a health person. And so does that make sense? I'm just wondering if there's a possibility to bring that triage person in earlier in the conversation versus later in the conversation, which just becomes more it only helps, nothing personal here, only helps the fire dispatch, but doesn't help us overall in regards to our dispatch and taking a look at mental health. Does that make sense? Is there any clarification that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think it's kind of hard for me to respond to that, in that I think there's two separate issues there. I understand the one issue, which is a belief that there should only be one dispatch center, and the Wacom Admin Board has got a committee yet once again. We've studied that 4 or 5 times in the short period I've been with the city, and we're studying it once again. So that's I think that question really has nothing, isn't necessarily relevant to the mental health discussion, because in the other, because I think at the end of the day, the transfer from the 911 center to the law enforcement center it's not like they go to 911 and they get a myriad of questions and triaging, and then they decide to transfer it over to fire, where they get another myriad of questions and triaging. It's pretty instantaneous. They answer the phone, they determine immediately that it's a fire or medical issue, and they push a button, it rings over, and one ring later, our dispatchers are answering the question or answering the phone and starting that questioning process. So, I do think the two issues are somewhat separated. I understand what you're saying, and in that, as far as where the people who will triage mental health calls come, I think that, again, is just going to be dependent on what the end system looks like that we end up building for the unarmed co-response.
Councilmember Hamel.
I want to address Councilmember Vargas's question. So I'm actually on the committee, on the Wacom board that was looking at consolidation. What happens is that politicians get assigned to the board, and every year or 2 years, you get a new politician on there. And inevitably, the ones that own businesses think that consolidation is the way to go. It's just like, it makes business sense, but that's not the only metric to be measured. That's just not it. I spent several hours at Prospect, which ironically is on Broadway. I think Prospect is where it used to be, but Prospect is our call center for Bellingham Fire. And I was really impressed with the folks that work there. And in speaking with them and having conversations, it became clear to me that that two call centers is just fine. There's really not an immediate cost savings. Consider the fact that you'd have to put those people somewhere. So where did the 4 dispatchers from Prospect go? They're not going to fit at Wacom, and Wacom's not going to fit at Prospect. So that would be a new center. Where's the money for capital outlay costs on that? We don't have that. I guess we could go for a bond or something like that, but. Aside, I think that really we need to think about different measurements and different metrics on how we measure why we have these 2 call centers. Chief is right. The call gets forwarded almost instantaneously. We actually voted to buy some software. I can't remember, it was about a year ago or so, maybe it was 2 years ago, to improve the speed of that call getting shifted. And it's almost instantaneous. It used to be like 10 or 15 seconds. Now it's a lot faster. And seconds count. When people are having a crisis, you need to, every minute it's 10% increase in a person dying if they're having a cardiovascular event. So I think it's, it is important to have that speed there. But I would just urge us to all think about different metrics. There are different outcomes than whether or not it makes, financial sense in the long run, or if, again, going back to patient outcomes, that's what I'm really after here.
Further questions or discussion from council? Just as a brief follow-up, I know that the Whatcom facility on Alabama certainly is in need of a new home. So I think it's a great time to be having this discussion. And as Councilmember Hamel has outlined, the complexity certainly reach beyond maybe the scope of this discussion today, but certainly something for council to consider as we go further, just those discussions. Something I've brought up before, just with respect to dispatch, is as we look at a myriad of options and needs as far as mental health and other response options, is whether that should continue to be staffed by Bellingham Police Department or perhaps another entity. But as you've mentioned, Councilmember Vargas, all of the unions involved and certainly players at the table. It is a weighty discussion, but one well worth having because of the impact on our community day in and day out. So thank you, Chief Hewitt, for your time and for coming before us today. We look forward to seeing you again at our next council meeting to address goals. I guess that would be 6 through 10. So thank you for that. And we appreciate your time this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.
So our next item this afternoon is Agenda Bill 23015, which is a discussion of options for civilian oversight of law enforcement in Bellingham. Concern about lack of effective oversight of police, particularly in instances of use of force, has driven demand for the creation of additional oversight mechanisms. Civil boards to oversee certain aspects of police activity or increase police accountability have been adopted in approximately 150 cities. According to the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, NACOLE, or NACOLE, during this season, council will, during this session, and probably all season, council will consider various options for civilian police oversight and consider whether to direct staff to further pursue one or more options. And so with this item this afternoon, I was first going to turn it over to Councilmember Lillquist for introduction.
Just very briefly, because we're going to have a presentation by our policy analyst, Mr. Mark Gardner, who will go over the highlights of the memo. Our community has been responding to a national conversation with regard to whether or not our police systems are delivering the justice we want. Even if it's, some people believe it's a locally an acute problem, other people feel it's a national problem. And I think without the appropriate mechanisms for transparency, we're just going to keep arguing about that. And so I'd rather we start talking about mechanisms for transparency so that those of us in City Hall and in the community will have a good window onto how our police are operating and how we're holding them accountable and how we're holding them to the highest standards. We talked about this last August, and there seemed to be broad agreement in the City Council. The time had come for us to look at proper mechanisms for accountability. But as Mr. Gardner will go over, there's no one best model. And so we need to begin a public process and an internal process to figure out what, if anything, we'd like to look further at. And so this is sort of a process question. And by the end of this meeting today, I'd like us to be able to decide on what the next steps might be. So that's all I have to say. Let's just hear from Mr. Gardner.
Good afternoon, Council. If I could, I'm going to share my screen. I have a short presentation that goes over a framework to help you think about this issue and hopefully get some direction from you in terms of next steps. So if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and share it now. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Great. I never liked that aspect of Zoom. It just disappears. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so I just have a short presentation. This is pretty high level, not a lot of detail, but it should give you some sense of what's out there and how to think about some structural issues in terms of next steps. In terms of looking at the broad range of oversight agencies or boards, there's probably pushing 200 or so of these now in place. And a study done recently by the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, or NACOLE, a nice acronym, identified these as 5 common areas that cut across most agencies. They looked at actually 97 in depth, but these 5 goals are improving public trust, ensuring accessible complaint processes, promoting thorough, fair investigations, increasing transparency, and deterring police misconduct. And they also note that other goals can be present as well, depending on what the locality is trying to do with their oversight. And NACOLE, which is, again, a national oversight, it's an association of oversight agencies, and they have developed this simplified framework developed by another researcher, but they've made it even simpler. There's many other ways to look at this topic, but this is a kind of a good way to think in terms of the basic structure. And these look at basically the authority and the focus of the oversight, and the typology that I'm going to go over here has 3 elements to it: review, investigative, and audit models of oversight. And people who do this research note that many times there's hybrids of these, so it's not a single pure model. To focus first on the review model, this is oversight that focuses on reviewing the quality of completed internal affairs investigations. It often involves a community board that provides input into internal investigations, but does not conduct independent investigations. This model may evaluate completed investigations, hear appeals, hold public forums, and make recommendations for further investigations and conduct community outreach. This is the most common form of oversight. It relies on local community involvement, usually in the form of a civilian board. It looks at the integrity of the investigative process rather than having specific authority over individual incidents or officers. It's the least expensive with the smallest staffing requirement. And it focuses on after-the-fact investigations of incidents, and so it's trying to improve the process, but is not necessarily transformative of the law enforcement system. The next model is the investigative model. This is a form of oversight that operates separately from local law enforcement. It requires substantial staffing with expertise. There's a need to create capacity to conduct independent investigations of allegations of misconduct against police officers. And this model is usually associated with larger cities. And this model developed later in the prior century in an effort, particularly in large cities, to really beef up the power of the investigative oversight of these agencies. It's the most independent form of oversight. It's the most expensive, requiring a large specialized staff. It's, as I mentioned, it's often employed in cities with a substantial history of misconduct, and the focus on after the fact of investigations of incidents means that it may not be transformative. And a more recent model, often again found in hybrid with one of the other models, is called the audit model. This is a focus on promoting large-scale systemic reform of police organizations. It may also monitor or review individual critical incident or complaint investigations. This approach involves the collection of data and the analysis of patterns of law enforcement activity. Many newer boards incorporate this function to some degree, and it usually requires some dedicated staff. In terms of comparison, it's at the mid-range of cost and complexity. It incorporates review of data patterns and conducts research to improve police practices. It may involve paid expert staff. It focuses on system-wide patterns and problems, and some evidence that Nicole presents indicate that this model has possibly a larger impact on catalyzing change, although that could partially be a figment of the fact this is a newer model. So newer oversight efforts sometimes have more impacts than old ones. But anyway, that's at least a qualitative observation that they were able to come up with from their survey of these different oversight agencies. And then the Nicole group mentions what they consider to be core elements of effective civilian oversight. I've simplified it slightly. I think there's now 13 that they list, but these are some of the main ones. They include independence, adequate jurisdictional authority, access to records and full cooperation of law enforcement, access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff, support of process stakeholders, adequate resources, public reporting and transparency, and the use of statistical pattern analysis, community outreach and involvement, and respect for confidentiality. Of course, the more of these you have, the more capacity you need to build, and you probably need to have larger staffs to optimize every single aspect of oversight. Just before getting into design options, the local context is that this was an extremely active year down in Olympia regarding legislation affecting criminal law enforcement, enforcement of law enforcement agencies. I do have a memo also in your packet that summarized some pieces of legislation that explicitly regulates police activities or oversight. There's many other pieces of legislation that affect criminal law and the operations of law enforcement. So this is really a subset of what's out there. But in particular, with regard to this issue, House Bill 1267 creates a new Office of Independent Investigations, which may meet the need for investigations of use of force. It's meant to be statewide, immediate response, independent investigations. I say may because it's brand new and nobody knows if it'll work. Just also noting locally, we do have a Safe Spaces program, which is operated by the Walk-in Dispute Resolution Center, relatively new, just up and running. Provides one pathway for people to lodge complaints against city departments, including the police. Just a general sense of looking at the literature, there's limited research on the effectiveness of these boards. Many do not appear to be able to solve deep-seated structural problems, which says to me that this is one tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool you need to use necessarily. And just one other point, there needs to be some investigation into employment law and state RCW in terms of how it impacts what a locality in Washington can do in terms of oversight. And just before getting into some local discussion, the group, Nicole, has two particular design principles that I'll mention. One is that jurisdictions should focus on best fit rather than best practices. when considering how to structure civilian oversight, and oversight should employ the least force necessary to accomplish its goals. So with that, I just wanted to put up what came to mind in terms of initial discussion questions. You might have your own questions, but this is what I came up with. First question, obviously, is whether or not to proceed with the development of additional oversight. If so, which model or a hybrid of oversight, and who should be consulted on the purpose and structure of this new oversight entity or board? What investigative powers should it have? Who should it report to? Should it report to the council, the mayor, or both? Should a board be able to conduct broad policy and data reviews consistent with the audit function? And where would staff be located organizationally? So that's my overview. I can answer any questions you might have.
Councilmember Hamel.
Less of a question, more of a, I've been trying to synthesize this for a while now. I think we started talking about this probably, 4 or 5 years ago? I mean, it's really been a while. I'm hopeful on House Bill 1267 being a tool in the tool belt that can be an independent investigator of any kind of incidents or officers. And I think that the expertise level for investigations is the bar is pretty high. And so I'm confident in that. And I believe that the auditing model most closely resembles sort of what I'm interested in seeing, but I think with a little bit more on the review side too, to involve community members to some extent in that process. And then the final thing, I know I see other people with their hands raised, so I'll make mine quick here. The Racial Equity Commission stakeholder group is coming online. They're beginning to be impaneled this month. And I did reach out to the one of the leaders of that group just today, and asked if would it be appropriate to ask them to chime in on it. And they haven't been seated yet. So I think that they still have to, they're just a brand new organization that Councilmember Huffman and I and several others kind of serve on the development team for that group, which will ultimately put forward a racial equity commission, which might be the body that could provide some more information and feedback from the community. So I would want that racial equity overlay to be in our thoughts on how we proceed here.
Councilmember Knudsen.
Yeah, I want to agree with Dan. This is, we're talking about an oversight committee. The only oversight committee we've ever had in the city of Bellingham is going to be one of our 9 bargaining units, which would be the police department. So I just want people to understand, an oversight committee, if you develop an oversight committee, it is something that has never been done before. And I understand why there are a lot of people that want to go down this road. But I want to give you an example of what I'm really afraid of. I'm probably not supposed to do this, but what are you going to do? Fire me in the next few months? So I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. We have, like Mark said, safe spaces to the Whatcom Dispute Resolution Center. After my vote on hazard pay, a complaint was filed to the Whatcom Resolution Center against me because I voted no on hazard pay, because I put myself into a frontline worker category with grocery workers, as I am at my regular job. They got mad at me and the complaint was filed. I don't think those are the kind of files we need, and those are the kind of complaints we need at City Council here. We all work for the community. If they don't like the job they're doing, next time you're up for re-election, they can vote you out. And if that's the kind of complaint we're going to get, I'm afraid we're going to get a lot of complaints, maybe unwarranted complaints against our police department that way too. So whatever we do, I think we really need to take a serious look at this. And it is one of our 9 bargaining units. I think it's something that's going to have to be talked about with the police guild. I know this is our initial shot at it. Michael brought it up and then Mark did the research, but I think there's a whole lot more to do. And if we're going to go down this road, it has to be pretty specific on what complaints we get, because you could turn, and that's my fear too on another subject with the ombudsman, because an ombudsman could get complaints about the way people vote too. And I don't think that's the way we need to go. But anyway, I have concerns about this, and hopefully it's looked at a lot longer.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thank you, Council President Stone. So there are 2 aspects of this that I find particularly compelling. And the first is the trust building aspect. I think if nothing else, a community that trusts its police department has a police department that has better clearance rates. So more cases get solved. And I think that that's particularly important, that we're building trust. And the civilian review sort of a entity could do that. The other aspect I think that is really important is the ability to do some data analysis and some review of policy and some of that important systemic change that needs to happen. And so I would hope to see those two components highlighted in this process. And I think that the question of what House Bill 1267 is going to bring to the table is a really big one. And so I think how that is going to overlay the Office of Independent Investigations, how that's going to overlay with this is a big question too. I think I foresee this being a long process, a long, thoughtful, and deliberate process to create some kind of oversight. I hope that it will be. Just being through the process of creating something that at the beginning we thought would maybe take 6 months, that'd be easy peasy quick. It's not, because there are so many different factors and so many different perspectives, and so much information that needs to be analyzed in creating something that is going to work really well. And so I would also hope that with this process, we're making sure to include all of those perspectives and the expertise, and that we've also got community members at the table helping to create some kind of board. So I don't know if maybe that's the next step. If the next step is that we authorize some kind of work group board, and we love work groups in local government, something like that. But I think I'd like to see that happen.
So I apologize to the next three speakers because I believe I probably have you out of order, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me. So Councilmember Vargas will go next.
Thank you, Council President. I think this is a really great discussion, and we have lost some trust, and building trust and transparency is very important. But I know that this is not going to be a super long process. I will say, and I've said it before, that I'm not at a point where I think that we are in dire need of an oversight committee. We've been trying to figure out where we're at. And I think that that's an important step for us right now. I would really like to have an update from the safe spaces in regards to the amount of people that are reaching out to them, if it's effective, if it's working, if we need to take another step. So this is one of the first steps that we took, and I would like to have an assessment on whether or not it's being effective before we take the next step. But I do think it is important for us to build trust and transparency right now. And I do want to do that looking at things step by step. So I'm hoping that, Council President, we could request an update on the Safe Spaces program before we continue take another step in this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you very much. First, Councilmember Knudsen, I'm sorry you received a complaint, because we all bring our life experience, our work history, a lot of things to being on the council. And that's a lot of times how we will start framing our goals and opinions, along with a lot of input from research, staff, and public opinion. And so I'm sorry that your personal experience was called into question, because working retail long ago is partly of my frame of being a strong union supporter. But with that aside, bringing in another area of my experience is in education. Often when we are undertaking something new, we often need to frame not only the goals, but what is the true issue that we're trying to address? And perhaps it's because I haven't been part of the conversation for the past 5 years. Before we fully move forward, as Councilmember Huffman and Hamill have very well pointed out, there is new legislation that hopefully, if successful, will be able to facilitate at a much better level than perhaps at a local level some of the concerns community members have expressed. Use of force, people who perhaps should lose their certification as officers due to misconduct, more open records, the inability for people to be able to be on investigation, moving to another municipality, another job, which I do think Bellingham is pretty prudent in how they conduct their job search to ensure that doesn't happen, but that's not across all municipalities. I would like to know, is this something that we should be really looking at a broader sense of partnering with the county and the sheriff? Because, you know, it may not just be a Bellingham service, but, you know, we are all part of a greater community. Also, a lot of the examples in the packet are of much larger municipalities that have billion-dollar budgets. So I have a hard time trying to figure out what would be best for Bellingham, because I don't have any examples that I can research that have this type of oversight for a municipality of 90,000 and a police force of under 150. It could be quite, what I move towards is kind of the audit, which is a higher cost, higher staff, because I really look at things in a sense of systematic change. So, you know, we have now an HR director, which is full-time dedicated HR director who will be working with our unions to negotiate contracts. So hopefully with that expertise, we can really look at how we look at discipline and what that chain is and where that review is. So I want whatever we're doing, we look through that lens to make sure that we're utilizing the resources we have in spot. I would like to see a little bit more about how some of these state measures, how these are going to be fleshed out to make sure we're not duplicating something at a great cost to the community when perhaps those funds could be used elsewhere. But as far as, you know, transparency, what I'd like to identify what is not transparent. And what would be the vehicle in order to make sure that that is transparent? Does it have to come through a commission, or is it through some other vehicle? So I think identifying the specific problems, and then that way we find the right tool to be able to address that. And I just don't feel like we have specifically identified what those are. A sense of transparency, a sense of community, a sense of fairness. You know, those, we hear that from individuals, and not to discount those concerns, but is that for a few or is that for many? So I really would like to try to, before we move forward in creating a panel for feedback, is as a maybe have a work session where we really drill down and identify that. I also want to involve our police department, and not to create a sense of obstacle to move forward, but to be collaborative, because I believe that many people want to make sure in that profession that things get better. And we have a good community policing philosophy, but it's relatively new. It's been about 10 years. And so, you know, I just had watched a documentary about community policing, where it started and what municipalities have embraced it and the systematic change that it has brought. So asking the question, how can we do things better, is one thing, but also asking our police department, how can you do things better? what have you identified? What resources do you need in order to be able to alleviate some of these issues? And it could be training. It could be additional resources. It could be just the permission to have maybe a more open process. I am not opposed to this at all. I just want to make sure that we're framing it really well so that we are being advantageous of the direction we go. Some of the research that I've done on large municipalities that have implemented community boards, it took so much training for those boards to really understand law, to understand the whole process, that in some situations when those boards were siding with the decisions that were done through discipline and through the internal investigation, the community that was all really wanting this citizen panel because they thought that there would be different outcome. When there wasn't different outcome, certain people in those communities wanted to get rid of that citizen panel. So I want to make sure that what we do is also aligning with the overall goals and outcome that the community members want. Because if we go forward and expectations aren't met, I just don't want to be future councils looking back going, well, we did this, and now the community still isn't happy if perhaps the outcome isn't what they wanted. So I think it's a good first step. I'm glad we're opening up that discussion. I think we have a lot of work to do. I don't think it's going to go entirely quickly. As Councilmember Huthman has stated, it's to do something really well that is going to have very positive outcomes for our community. I think we have to really make sure that we do it right.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'm not going to try to go on too long, but this has been a very important topic for me. I've spent the last year, as probably all of you have, thinking about the issues of justice and what it is that city government does or doesn't do to make sure we have a just and safe community. We've looked at police officer accreditation and disaccreditation. I've suggested we rethink traffic enforcement. We reviewed the 8 can't wait set of empirically proven police reform policies. And this is sort of the last lift, I think, that we really need to engage in. We have been talking about this for about 5-6 years, but I want us to focus on a model that will actually fit and work and that we can accomplish. Let me comment that one of the missing pieces I knew we could never provide, which is a truly independent investigative authority. We can never be independent of ourselves. We needed the state government. I personally wanted the state AG's office to take this on. Legislature, they chose to make this Office of Independent Investigations. I hope it works because we do need true independence for those investigations. And there's no way we could ever create that locally. You would never be independent if we created it. I think we can address Gene's concerns if we realize that the investigative model is just simply going to be out of our reach. It's also the most expensive model. It's also the least community driven. It's the least civilian. It's basically another legal agency. And I don't want to create another legal agency, right? We've got this Office of Independent Investigation. I hope they fill it. What was the problem with what was proposed 5-6 years ago is that it was an investigative agency with basically no training, no legal expertise, no recognition of due process rights, okay? That's one reason it was unworkable. So also realize most of these investigative bureaucracies, they're imposed by court order or by the federal Justice Department, right? They're imposed by a higher legal power onto a misbehaving police force. And we don't have that situation, thankfully. And so we're not going to even think about, I think, creating that investigative body. We can't get there. We shouldn't even try. So I'd like us to realize that that model exists, but it's not a fit for us. What I like about the review model and also the audit model is they take a systemic approach. They're not about finding bad apples and holding them accountable, right? What we have been asked to do to understand how to create positive change is take a systemic and institutional look. Systemic bias, right? Systemic racism, or systemic issues. We need a systemic look if we're trying to create systemic transformation. And the review and audit models try to look at the entire department for patterns or practices or areas that need change. So I prefer these models because they move away from the narrative of finding bad apples and start talking about the institution itself and how we can make it better. My goal is really simple. I want a safer public. The members of the public to feel safer. I want them to feel better served. And I think one way we can get there is rebuilding trust. And the way we do that is with transparency. So our goal, my goal, is what is the best way we can create the most increase in transparency with the least amount of bureaucracy, least amount of expense, least amount of trouble, and the greatest level of community involvement, which again is why I go towards a review model. It seems to fit our situation and fit what people are asking for. They're not asking for a bureaucracy of investigators. They're asking for a window on how our police operate. Other notes. So I would also say there's kind of this question that we're not sure where we're at. But there's disagreement among different people, whoever you talk to, about whether or not Bellingham has problems and how, if we do, what are they? Which again, in my mind, leads us to the review model. The review model basically says, let's take a look. Let's see what there is to see. Let's have outside eyes, outside of the city, that is, take a look at it and then come back to us and tell us what they saw. If we don't know how things are, if we don't all agree on how things stand, then let's start with a review model. So with regard to transparency, you may have got Ms. Rodriguez's email today. I'd never seen what Ms. Rodriguez presented, which was a spreadsheet of all the various complaints of our officers and the dispositions of those complaints. Most of those complaints were considered unfounded or weren't pursued, but several resulted in discipline. I don't know what that spreadsheet means. I know what it says, but I don't know what it means. Were all those outcomes, all those dispositions proper and appropriate? Do they show a healthy department or an unhealthy department? I don't know. It seems to me like a civilian oversight board would have the time to sit down and go over exactly that sort of question and let us know what they saw. I like a lot of the features of the audit model, but the way I see it is if you know you need transformational change, then you need an audit model to basically dig in and do a kind of a forensic dive on how your department works to figure out what needs to be changed. Okay, we don't agree that that's the case yet, right? The audit model, in my mind, doesn't fit us. If we knew that there was some pattern or some problem and we could all agree on it and we could resource it, then yeah, I'd say the audit model is the way to get there. But we don't. So I keep going to the review model. And what I want out of this committee meeting right here is not too much more talking. I want us to figure out how to move the process forward. I really liked what's happening with the Racial Equity Commission, where you kind of have a nucleus of people who get the idea rolling. But then they bring in a larger group of people to kind of discuss what form it would take. And then finally, you get a body at the end. Okay, I'd like us to move out of the discussion here among city leaders and move it into that next phase. I would like us to move into some kind of stakeholder engagement. I appreciate Mr. Hamill's suggestion that maybe we can piggyback on the members who will be appointed to the stakeholder group for the Racial Equity Commission, not the commission itself, but this kind of stakeholder group. I think we need to move to the next step beyond talking and say, hey, city council is serious. We think we like the idea of a review model or whatever, or an audit model. Let's start shopping the idea around because as Ms. Huffman says, this isn't going to happen quickly. All the more reasons to start today. I think that we all want our community members to feel safe and well served. And we know to do that, we need to build trust. And one way you build trust is with sunshine and openness and transparency. And I think I'd like to create a mechanism for greater transparency, greater trust, and a safer community. Please, can we agree to a good next step in this process to create some form of civilian oversight, one that would fit our community?
Councilmember Vargas.
just to be clear, to segue from what you just said, Councilmember Lillquist, is that as we're pursuing this and reading through all these documents, I would say that I agree with you. And if we are going to go in this direction, I am most supportive of a review model. So I hope that gives you a little bit of direction.
Any further comments from other council members? I guess what I would add is that I understand, yes, not wanting to create additional bureaucracy if it's not going to be advantageous and serve the actual end means or needs that we're trying to address. But the trust and transparency pieces are critical. And I would, I guess, sum it up to limit the talking, like you say, we're looking for direction on next steps, is I wouldn't dismiss the audit piece, I guess, as quickly as some may. I believe that the Bellingham Police Department is doing a lot of good things. And I also believe that there's always room for improvement. I also believe that when we talk about institutional and systemic issues of racism and other isms that may in some way, taint good work, right? If even ourselves here in City Hall, I think that audit at some point is necessary, because we don't know what we can't see and what we're unable to see simply because of the lens that we're given, that we're looking at things through. And so I think the key piece with any review and or audit is those external eyes, right? That this is an external process that's going to help, where there are professionals and also stakeholders and people who are going to be, sort of helping with this process. So one of the other pieces I wanted to speak to was Councilmember Vargas mentioned the safe spaces and wanting a report back on that. My concern is that was initially rolled out as a pilot program, and I'm not certain to what degree we have broadly, I don't want to say advertised, but promoted the Safe Spaces program and what extent that program is being utilized. So when the Safe Spaces program was initially rolled out, one of my concerns was that we're going to check a box and create this program, and then when nobody uses it and there aren't any complaints reported, we're going to say, look, we did this, no one's complained, so we're doing a good job, we can move on and check that box. I don't want to say that there's, a bunch of complaints that haven't been brought forward, and, I don't know. And so my concern is just wanting to make sure that we're doing, again, focusing on transparency and trust, that there's also some engagement with the community about safe spaces, and how many people are aware of that program, how many people have utilized it, if there is feedback from the community as well about how well that program has serve them, and also obviously feedback from Whatcom Dispute Resolution Center themselves and Moonwater and her team, because it was a pilot. And I think the ask for that organization was extremely demanding in some levels. And so we were trying to sort of, narrow that down and give it more focus. And so perhaps that's not the solution, or maybe it is, part of the solution. And so I think the key piece, and I don't remember which council member mentioned it, perhaps it was a collective assertion, but in not creating the solution until we better understand, right, what the quote unquote problem or need is. And so for that reason, I would go back again to a review and audit type next step, I guess I would say. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. You actually said much of what I wanted to say, as far as a hybrid would be more, in my opinion, more appropriate. And to kind of, Councilmember Lillquist, you in a way supported that when you said that email that listed the various complaints and the percentages that, were unfounded and so forth. A review would look at an individual piece and then the next piece and the next piece, whereas an audit actually is what is going to answer that question. What does this mean? And so without the audit, without being able to look at things systematically and holistically based on the complaints and what type of trends, then we don't know how to necessarily go forward with recommendations, whether it's more training or that we do have a systemic issue or perhaps an issue with, a small group. And my last comment, I know this is about police and accountability and making sure that the public feels safe. And forgive me if this information has been presented in the last year. We get so much, but have we had a community survey where people have weighed in on their opinion, like a community-wide, of our law enforcement? What is truly the viewpoint? Are we basing this on people who contact us and those who spoke during the summer, during the listening sessions, or is there data to say that a certain percentage of the community don't feel safe or feel good about our local police department? Because I would like to see what those numbers are, not to necessarily validate the voices we've heard, but I would like to see what community-wide that opinion is about service. And then my last thing is as Councilmember Knudsen has stated, that it's one of many departments across the city, and I'm sure other departments have complaints, based on public contact. And I would like, as we go forward, if we go forward with a particular model, that in the back we kind of keep an eye on, is this process something that could be utilized for across city departments? Because if we are looking at systematic issues of bias or racism or mistreatment or not good customer service, whatever the outcome is this something that could be applied across the city so that as a municipality, we can serve better through all of our public service contact across the community? Because I don't think necessarily just one department is the issue. I think potentially we could benefit across the board, which is why I had originally preferred the ombudsman position, was that ability to really look at things holistically across the city. I know that is cost prohibitive at this point because it would be an entire department being developed, and we're just not that big size of a city. We're not Seattle. But if it's something we move forward with, I'd always want to make sure that we keep that lane open, that it might be able to be expanded across other departments.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. So I really do want us to get to next steps, and I'm going to suggest the next step has to do with finding a way to get community feedback and input on the narrower set of models we're talking about. I've heard support for both the review and the audit models, and as Mr. Gardner indicated, there's actually gradations and hybrids between those two. I think that's where our discussion is going. Let's get some feedback on that. Let's ask ourselves who needs to be invited to give us feedback, what communities need to be reached out to. And yeah, how do we reach out to police leadership? How do we include the mayor and the city administration in this process? Is this going to be a council-led process? Because to a certain extent, I think we're going to need some kind of administrative support to do this properly. So, for example, Mayor Fleetwood, we have a part of our website called Engage Bellingham. And we started to use that more recently because of COVID to try to find ways to reach out. I mean, how would you feel about, for example, us talking and working with using the Engage Bellingham site for part of our outreach? If days get better, can we start talking about maybe some in-person forms of feedback? I'd like for us to talk seriously about getting feedback. So it's not just 7 people and the people we talk to, but it's a lot more people whose input is fed into this. So Seth, I mean, do you feel that you might be able to have resources to support a public process? And if so, where does that fit in your busy workload?
Councilmember Lillquist, if I may, sorry, Mayor Fleetwood, I'll turn it over to you in one moment. I know that we have at least an hour and a half, if not longer, of executive session this afternoon. And what you shared just now, I think is of utmost importance. But I also want to do that justice. And I feel like that's going to be part of a much broader discussion, or I hope it is. And so what I would request is that this item come back at our next meeting for part 2 to focus on sort of that hybrid model. Mayor Fleetwood, I certainly don't want to take your time if there's something you wanted to share at this time, but likewise, I'd like to bring it back.
Well, a question was directed to me, so I'll answer it. First off, I would just observe that, timing wise, don't have to design the whole thing right now. I think everyone recognizes that. Contextually, of course, this is limited by what we talked about at the last meeting and the fact that we have limited staff seeking to prioritize work plans. And so certainly at the next, we can bring this back and continue the conversation. It seems to me a next step that might be helpful as far as information gathering, if there's support for audit and review, is to perhaps have Mr. Gardner come back with examples in other communities so we have a better understanding of what those models actually are. We've seen an outline form of it now, but if we hear of how an optimal model, in your view, Mr. Lillquist, has worked in another city, and we have better clarity about how it actually operates, that I think might be informative. So, but to your big question, as far as staff support, I mean, clearly this is going to require, this can't just be a council thing. We work together as one team. We're different branches, but let's see how that unfolds after the next meeting. Get more clarity on that.
Thank you, Mayor Fleetwood. Any further direction at this time needed, Mr. Gardner, or are you able to join us again next meeting?
I can certainly do that. I could bring in a few examples of a couple of these models in operation that might be useful. Haven't done that research yet, but I'll do a first cut at that, if that would be helpful.
I think that would be great. I see head nods, so we'll say yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Anything further, Councilmember Lillquist? Are we good? Okay. Yeah, my apology. I'm glad that will come back, but a good part 1. So thank you all. And so that closes out our committee of the whole, but we have a couple of items before we go to executive session. One is approval of minutes. So we have a set of minutes from our last meeting, May 24th, 2021.
Move approval.
Motion's made by Councilmember Knudsen, a second by Councilmember Huffman. Any discussion or changes? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No abstentions, so 7-0. And then older new business. Councilmember Hamel.
I'm going to make a motion here to replace myself with Councilmember Huffman on the Watcom board. I've cleared this with obviously Councilmember Huffman, thank you, and Council President Stone, Alan Mariner from Legal, make sure that because I'm the chair of the Public Health, Safety, and Justice Committee, that there's not going to be any problems there. And I also notified Sheriff Alpo, who is the chair of the board for Watcom, and everyone said yes, and as well as Greg Erickson, who is the manager of operations over there. So that's my motion to replace myself with Councilmember Huffman on that board.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Hamel, a second by Councilmember Knudsen. Any discussion by council? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed? No. Okay, so that passes 7-0. Thank you very much. And thank you, Councilmember Huffman. Anything else for older new business? Okay. Seeing none, as I alluded to, we have 8 items before us in executive session this afternoon. And I'm going to request that executive sessions start a couple minutes after I adjourn, just to give time for a refill on water and a restroom break. So, but 8 items for executive session. So the first is a potential property acquisition with stamps for approximately 3 minutes. The second item is a potential property acquisition, again with stamps for approximately 3 minutes. The third item is a potential property acquisition with stamps for approximately 3 minutes. The fourth item is a potential property acquisition with stamps for approximately 3 minutes. The fifth item is litigation, Eldred versus City of Bellingham et al. with Brady, approximately 10 minutes. The sixth item is litigation, Fox versus City of Bellingham with Brady for approximately 10 minutes. The seventh item is litigation, Young versus City of Bellingham with Brady for approximately 15 minutes. And the eighth item is litigation, Lev versus City of Bellingham and Seth Fleetwood with Mariner for approximately 30 minutes. So we will adjourn and go to executive session and then join the public this evening at 7 p.m. for our regular meeting. So thank you very much, and we are adjourned for this afternoon.